you have, the 1700s, 1800s, where you have banks participating in this is called fractional reserve lending, where you're lending out more than you actually have, nationalizing it and legalizing it to centralizing it with the central bank. And the central bank is just a bank, but they operate as a bank to the banks. So if bank over here has a bank run because they lent out too much and they don't have enough gold, well, they can just get the gold from the central bank, who gets it from the other banks. And so over the last couple thousand years, you've had this system continually become more and more and more centralized. It's the same game. New money's being created, more is being lent out than there are actually real resources to back it up, but you're centralizing it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Gentempo.com community. And hey, we're having interesting conversations with really interesting people. And what I'm really enjoying right now is I go out and create valuable content, or find valuable content or valuable conversations to have and share with you. And today is no exception. As I was searching for great content on YouTube, I came across Joseph Brown, who's absolutely an expert. His company is Heresy Financial, and he did a video called The Origin of Modern Money and Its Dark Future. And man, let me tell you something. Get ready to go to school over the next 30 minutes. We're going to break down, the whole concept of central bank digital currency, but we're going to bring it all the way back to the history of money up until today and talk about some of the issues and problems and how we can hopefully avoid some of these big concerns that are happening in the world today. Joseph Brown, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching, I just couldn't stop watching the video. And I made a comment that, I've done maybe 50 of these interviews over the past few months. And I've never taken so many notes on a 26-minute video. There's just so much packed content. I just hope people sit through this long enough to get the pearls of wisdom. But I think it's just going to take off real well. So the origin of money and its dark future. And what we're really talking about is this whole concept of central bank digital currency being kind of right in front of us. It seems like the world's going in that direction. Could you tell us a little bit about the history of money and how we've gotten here, how we've gotten to this place?
Yeah, absolutely. So the history of money, it's like you said, there's a lot packed into it, but essentially you go back as far back as you can. Anthropological evidence shows that the earliest money we have record of is not commodity money like gold or silver. It's credit-based money. So, they recorded favors with each other basically through things like tally sticks, and developed pretty complex financial markets on top of it. And, it's something like barter, for instance, never existed. We have no evidence of any economy ever existing on barter, because it just doesn't work. You'd be trading barrels of apples for shoes to somebody who doesn't actually want apples, and so it doesn't work. But at some point, this is probably around 3,000 years ago, the nation state, the more of a modern nation state, started to develop, and governments wanted a way to pay and keep standing militaries. And gold and silver emerged as a commodity money system that worked very well. And part of the reason why a commodity-based money system works well is because it makes it hard to artificially get purchasing power. And so let's just say you've got a full-on gold standard where the only money is gold coins. And for now, let's say you can't counterfeit those gold coins. Let's also say you can't go into the ground and get more gold out of the ground. You've got an absolute fixed supply of money. Well, what else is happening? Money supply can't grow or decline, but the economy can grow or decline. So you have technological advancements. You have people figuring out ways to get more for less. You have people figuring out new farming techniques to get more food out of the ground. You have things like this have taken place all throughout history, where the end result is actually deflation, because you have a fixed amount of money on one end, but a growing supply of goods and services on the other end. And so that means that if it took you all of the money to be able to buy all the stuff before, but now you have more stuff, well, it still takes you all the money to buy all the stuff, So that means the money is going a lot further than it used to. And since the money is going further than it used to, the way that works out in prices, that means prices come down, because as things move from being scarce to being abundant, they get cheaper. Something that's extremely abundant is the air, right? Nobody pays for air unless you move into an environment in which it's scarce. And so if you have a health condition, breathable air is scarce for you. So you're going to pay for air. If you go deep enough underwater, breathable air is scarce. So you're going to pay for that with your scuba equipment. And so as things move from scarce to abundant, they get cheaper. And that is natural deflation.
That's kind of blown me away already, because since I've been paying attention to money, I'm 50 years old, I would say for the past 2 years only, right? And only thing that I've ever known is that money over time has deflated, right? So you're saying originally, the original concept was that your money would increase, even if you held on to it, because its value would increase because you can buy more stuff with it. And
that's correct.
And we're looking at an upside down of that currently now. We'll get to that. But somehow, some way, they flipped it on us, right? That's
exactly. Yeah. At some point that flipped, and the system right now hides the deflation that's still actually happening, but it's hidden by the inflation that's taking place from our monetary system. And so the way, and this isn't like, we look at, 50 years and think, that's a long time, but in the scheme of history, that's a blip. For almost all of human history, we have deflation as the overwhelming force of history, where things get cheaper, your money gets more valuable, and you get blips, isolated time periods where you have the opposite happen because of top-down control. And the first time this started happening was while we had a gold standard. It was brought about by goldsmiths. Goldsmiths were the original bankers. And so what you had was eventually, like I said, money gets more expensive relative to all the stuff. So stuff gets cheaper. So in the beginning, you could take your gold coin, slap it down on the counter, and pay for a beer, right? Well, 1,000 years later, wheat has gotten a lot cheaper to make. Techniques to improve how efficient you are at making beer have gone through the roof. And so beer is cheaper. So if you slap a gold coin down, it's not going to buy one beer anymore. Maybe it'll buy you a night at the hotel, or maybe later it'll buy you a whole house or whatever it is, a horse. And so you can't use that for everyday transactions anymore. So it moved the most valuable metal, gold, from being a medium of exchange over just more to a store of value. And so you have silver and copper being the change basically for gold. And so you have to do something with your gold now. And I'll pause and just mention that even though people can mine and you can get more gold and silver and copper out of the ground, the fact is it requires labor, and it requires time, and it requires resources. And because of that, the inflation rate of gold has only been 1 to 1.5% forever, every year, forever. It's been on par with population growth. That's never exceeded 2% because it's so difficult to get more of it. So there has been some inflation, just not enough to keep pace with the deflation. So people still experienced dropping prices. Enough dropping in prices meant people needed to do something with their gold. So they went to the goldsmith and said, keep it for me. You already have a lot of gold, so you've already got the security, you've got the infrastructure. Keep my gold. Give me a receipt, a little note that says, hey, Joe can come back and get this at any time. So I got my receipt, and if I needed to buy a horse, I go take it, I drop off my receipt, get my gold, go buy my horse, and then he takes his gold and gives it back to the goldsmith. Well, pretty quickly you realize you don't have to do that. There's an extra step in there. I've got my receipt that says I can go get my gold at any time. I'm just going to give him that receipt, and then he can keep that receipt. At this point, there hasn't been any inflation. You've just swapped metal for paper. But the goldsmiths look at this as a big opportunity, because they're like, hey, I've got a ton of gold sitting in storage. Nobody's coming to get it anymore. I can make bank on this by starting to make loans. And so they're going to take one of your gold coins without telling you and lend it out to somebody. As soon as they do that, you have inflation. Because you have, let's say, 10 pieces of paper representing 10 pieces of gold that are all trading in the economy for goods and services. The moment one of those pieces of gold gets lent out, you have that same piece of gold being represented twice. in transactions because you have it being represented once by the piece of paper that can be redeemed at any time, and then you have it represented again by itself as the loan. This cascades and increases until the money supply gets to a point where either people realize there's too much gold circulating, there's fraud, I'm going to go get my gold before everybody else realizes. Then you have a run on the bank, everybody goes and tries to get it, there's not enough there. Or since it's all debt, you have the debt at some point has to get paid back. And so the paying back of debt spirals into people having to call loans and go get it from other people. And they realize this is all artificial growth. Either way, you get a collapse, run on the bank. Should have been outlawed. It wasn't outlawed. It was nationalized. So we went from banks and goldsmiths doing it to nations doing it. And they said, you can do this, even though it's fraud, but you have to have a charter or a license from the government to do this. And so you have, the 1700s, 1800s, where you have banks participating in this is called fractional reserve lending, where you're lending out more than you actually have to back it up. And at some point you have a run on the bank. Well, that's bad, right? Because people lose their money. But at least there's a built-in mechanism where if a bank participates in that system, then they get run out of business at some point.
Right.
Well, in 1913, the United States established the Federal Reserve. So you went from it being just Wild West to nationalizing it and legalizing it to centralizing it with the central bank. And the central bank is just a bank, but they operate as a bank to the banks. So if bank over here has a bank run because they lent out too much and they don't have enough gold, well, they can just get the gold from the central bank who gets it from the other banks. And so over the last couple thousand years, you've had this system continually become more and more and more centralized. It's the same game. New money's being created, more is being lent out than there are actually real resources to back it up, but you're centralizing it. Now, one iron law about risk is that you cannot eliminate risk, you can only transfer it. When you go buy life insurance, that doesn't eliminate the risk of you dying, it transfers that risk to the life insurance company, right? When you go buy fire insurance, no matter what kind of risk it is, you're transferring it. Free markets do it in a way where it's a win-win, because if you die, you don't want your family to be wiped out. And so you're willing to pay the higher price statistically than it's actually going to cost. And the insurance company makes out because they're charging more. So it's a win-win. But in this situation, when you're transferring risk from the entire system so that there is no risk of failure at the lower end, then you have all the risk of failure isolated and concentrated at the top.
Well, that's my question. So how does that, so if you've got a bunch of little banks that are limiting their risk of going under and they're just basically leveraging up, how does that solve the problem?
It doesn't. So 1913 is when it started, right? Well, most people don't know about the first Great Depression that happened in 1920. There's a great book on it called The Forgotten Depression by Jim Grant. And this was in 1920, it started. This was only 7 years after the Federal Reserve was established, and it was due to an artificial increase of the money supply through easy credit. And their solution to fix it was the right solution. They said, okay, we're going to raise interest rates. The government actually balanced the budget, and it fixed itself within 18 months. They called it the Great Depression at the time, because it was the worst recession they'd ever experienced. Hoover was alive at that time, obviously, and he said, if something like this ever happens and I'm in power, I will do everything in my power to make it easier on the people to survive and live through, because it's painful for a short amount of time if you just let it go. Well, he got his chance, and he was in office when the Great Depression hit, and he stuck to his word. And they started up all of these intervention programs, and FDR on the campaign trail actually criticized Hoover for not being, free markets enough, not allowing things to happen. Well, obviously, that was just to get elected. He doubled down on everything Hoover was doing. So the idea that Hoover was free markets, laissez-faire, and FDR came in and tried to rescue is completely wrong. FDR doubled down on everything Hoover did and made it much worse. And the pain lasted for decades rather than 18 months. And so within 1920, so within about 15 to 17 years, you have two of the worst economic crises that our country had ever seen within 15 years of the creation of the central bank.
Now, the first time it corrected itself naturally, there was some pain, but it created. So what I'm saying is, I've heard, I'm a chiropractor by trade, so just but I've heard, if say the situation we're in now, even though it's a bigger hole, but allowing it to take a natural progression with inflation and not kicking it down the road, but literally owning up to it and going through a recession or depression right now, ultimately would be the right thing to do.
Right.
Am I right or wrong? Or, I mean, is
there's big debate about that. But essentially what you have is a lot more short-term pain if you let it unravel naturally. You have a lot of bankruptcy, you have a lot of defaults, you have a lot of insolvency, you have a lot of joblessness, you have a lot of short-term pain. And then as a result of that, it's kind of like a fire. What happens in a forest fire is it deposits a lot of nitrogen in the soil to allow much faster and robust growth going forward. The problem is when you get too much dead wood, basically, you have a lot of misallocation of resources and malinvestments in an economy. If you then allow the fire to go through, like in nature, if you have a big forest fire, it burns off the topsoil. Now that nitrogen doesn't do anything. It doesn't matter. You've let it accumulate too much. And so the debate is, hey, if we were talking about 50 years ago, maybe that's right. But at this point, if we let it crash, we would never recover. We would be a third world country for the rest of time. And so there is big debate about that, about what's the right policy and right thing to do going forward. But essentially, either way, you are choosing, the policymakers, central planners are choosing winners and losers. And so there's not going to be universal happiness regardless of the choices made.
Okay, so for the first time in history, the second depression, it was more fueled by creating policies not allowing it to burn down. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So the way that unfolded was there was FDR was doing everything he could to cause inflation. And so one of the crazy things, like we remember stories from grandparents about how hard that time was. People were hungry, right? FDR was burning crops to try and push crop prices higher. Supply and demand, right? If there's less supply, higher prices. At a time of that much pain, central planners, in an attempt to artificially boost prices, were burning food. And so this is the lunacy. You're trying to do all of these things to cause a desired outcome from the top. And one of those things, in addition to burning food, number one, making it illegal to own gold, confiscated all of that gold that was held in bank vaults, transferred it to the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve's gold reserves grew. He then increased the price of gold, which, if you know what the Federal Reserve was able to do based on their gold, they were able to print a certain number of dollars based on how much gold they have. Well, now they got more gold and it's higher price now, so they can print a lot more dollars. So the money supply expanded rapidly as a result of that. But at least America had gold. When you look at the end of World War II, most of the rest of the world had depleted their gold reserves. And so that gave us a big opportunity for the rest of the world. They're like, hey, we don't have gold. You have gold. We'll just use dollars. We'll use dollars that are backed up by gold. And at any time, they said, at any time after Bretton Woods, that was the agreement. Anybody in the rest of the world can redeem your dollars for gold, right? And so it's the same game. The goldsmith said, give us your gold. We'll give you paper. You can redeem it at any time. The bank said, give us your gold. We'll give you paper. You can redeem it at any time. When that failed, centralized up to the Federal Reserve, they said, give us your paper or give us your gold. We'll give you paper. You can redeem it at any time for gold. And then that failed. They took the gold. They gave the same idea to the rest of the world. Give us your gold. We'll give you paper. You can redeem it at any time. 30 years later, 1971, shocker, they printed more dollars than there was gold to back it up. It's the age-old plan, age-old trick. And everybody in the world was trying to get their gold back. You had another run on the bank. We were 2 weeks away from running out of our gold reserves when Nixon finally just said, wow, we're going back on our agreement. We don't have the gold. Nobody gets gold. Now everybody has to use dollars. And that was the first time in thousands of years where the global financial system moved from being a commodity-based monetary system to a credit-based monetary system again. So I mentioned that came before a commodity-based monetary system. We're back on a credit-based monetary system now, just like we were before the gold standard started.
So now since 1971, gold is removed. Now we can just print money. Now there's a whole other issue, right? Now it's not even based on anything. So let's talk about what's happened from then till now, and what they want to do next, right? So now we're looking at almost revamping the system entirely, and I've got concerns about that. But let's talk about 71 till now, how we got here, and what's going on with eventually getting the central bank digital currency.
Yeah, absolutely. Ever since the world left the commodity standard and has been on a credit standard, or some people call it pure fiat system, basically the same thing, you've had a far greater frequency of hyperinflationary episodes around the world, of bank crises around the world, of financial crises, just general collapses and crashes and recessions. And the reason for this is because it comes down to economic calculation, price calculation. So if the amount of wheat that's produced every year is the same amount of wheat that's consumed every year. We don't have decades-long stockpiles of wheat, right? Nobody's using wheat as jewelry. You grow the wheat, make bread, it gets bought and consumed. So let's say for whatever reason, next year in 2022, half the wheat is produced as we have normally produced. That means that necessarily half the wheat will need to be consumed than we consume this year, right? Because everything that's produced is consumed and vice versa. And the way that you have to communicate that information out to the system some way, right? So you could have central planners read from a list and say, okay, Joe gets half the bread he got. My uncle gets twice the amount of bread that he got. This bakery gets zero bread, so they're going out of business now. You could have somebody making all the decisions based on pure, fair, and unbiased metrics, right? Or what the free market does is it uses the pricing system. So I don't need to know anything about wheat production. I can know zero about wheat production. But if the price of bread is double what it was last year, I might not buy as many loaves this year. The bakery down the street might lean more towards going gluten-free, right? Using corn flour or something else to make up more of their production. So nobody has to know anything about the production or anything. You just need to look at the price. Prices are simply information about relative scarcity or abundance of all goods and services. Mm-hmm. That's all prices are.
Right.
Well, people forget that money has a price as well. It's the interest rate. And so when you have interest rates in a free market, they're going to communicate the relative scarcity of money versus all the goods and services. And so if the savings pool is small, well, that signals a high interest rate, because in order to get your hands on money, you're competing with everybody else. Everybody's trying to get that small amount of money. Interest rates are high. And so it signals, be very careful, rebuild the savings pool, because if you get savings, you can lend it out and make money with a higher interest rate. When interest rates are low, it signals an abundance of money relative to all the goods and services. It means go out there and take risks. It means go out and spend money. This is a time ripe for growth and take risks, because we've got a big savings pool. You can risk it. You can, you can try some things. And if you lose, because there's a large savings pool. Well, what happens when you print money and lower interest rates? You're not expanding the real pool of savings. You're not changing the real amount of goods and services. All you're doing is sending a false signal about the relative scarcity of money versus everything else. And so you're sending a signal to the economy that there's a lot of savings. Go out and spend, go out and get debt, go out and take risks, when the savings pool is actually small. And so you get misallocation of resources without real resources to back it up. You don't have that real pool of savings to rescue you if you make mistakes, and you do make mistakes. And so that's why we've seen this ever increasing frequency of financial crises that have to then be bailed out by ever increasing amounts of money printing and lowering interest rates. And that's why we've seen an exponential rise in the money supply over the last few decades, because they've had to do that to continue to try and bail out the system.
Yeah, and especially in the last 3 years, right? They're just if you just look at that, they're just printing money. So it's crazy and it's scary. It's really scary when you start to see what's really happening. I mean, my home value, right? My home cost went
Hmm.
up within the 3 years I lived here, a couple $100,000. Like that
Yeah,
doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Except for it costs just takes a lot more of those less valuable dollars to purchase the same thing. So
exactly.
it's people are falsely secure over this situation right now. And are there some of us who are a little bit nervous about what's going to happen next? So let's talk about where you see things going. We're talking about digital currency, right? And some people think
Hmm.
of crypto, right? But this is not crypto. This is central bank digital currency, very different, right? This is
Yeah,
centralized. It's controlled by the same people who got us in the mess we're in right now. So,
yeah.
what does the future look like? Let's talk about central bank digital currency, how it might work, and then maybe some of the negative things to be cautious of or concerned about with the new system like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing that's necessary to understand here is that we need to understand what a ledger-based monetary system is. A ledger-based monetary system is not new. We think of Bitcoin, it's a new invention. It's not. There have been people groups and cultures who have used ledger-based monetary systems before. So there's three types of monetary systems. We've covered the credit-based system, which is now, and the first one. We've covered commodity-based monetary systems. This is the third type of monetary system. It's a ledger-based system. So the easiest way for me to visualize this, imagine a giant billboard. Magic billboard. It's visible to everyone in the world. And this billboard has a record of the amount of money that every single person has on it. In addition to the amount of money, it has every transaction of how everybody got that money back to, let's say, the beginning of time, beginning of money. And all of that information is simultaneously available to everybody because it's a magic billboard, right? Everybody can see all the money and all the transactions. And if somebody were to get up there on a ladder, erase one of the numbers and say, I don't have $10, I have $10 million. Everybody can see it and it'd say, nope. First of all, I saw you change that. And we all know that the real answer is you have $10, but also there's no transaction history there. So that $10 million didn't come from anybody. So we know that it's fake because there's no history of where you got that from other people. So that's all a ledger-based monetary system is. It's a ledger, a list of all the money and all the transactions. That's it. We've had this before. There was a people group in the I can't remember the name of the islands, and they used things called rye stones. They were giant stones, 5, 10, 15 feet tall, that were shaped like donuts. And ownership of these stones was a matter of public record. And it was percentage based. So everybody in the community knew, hey, Joe owns 1% of that giant rock. Nancy owns 3% of that giant rock, and so forth. And everybody knew how it was an oral history. Most of history is an oral history, and everybody remembered and everybody knew. And whenever a transaction took place, the public ledger would be updated. And so I would transfer one of my 2% ownership to somebody in exchange for a cow, and everybody would agree, and everybody then would remember, okay, now you own less of the money. What they didn't anticipate was that there were people on the other side of the world who had the ability to make more of these stones very efficiently and cheaply. And so when colonizers, explorers came over and realized, hey, they have real resources and all they want is a rock. Well, I can give them a rock and I can get something that I want way more than the rock. And the old wise people in these communities said, we cannot accept the giant rye stones from the outsiders. We should only accept the ones that we already have. Well, the allure of getting rich is somebody saying, but he's going to give me 100% of that giant new rock for just one cow. I'm going to do that because absent that, I would have to exchange it for 1% of the existing rock. And obviously, that's a hyperinflationary type of event where you have a bunch of money flood into the system and it drains the system of the real resources. And their society, their economy collapsed until they rebuilt on the new global financial system. The next thing to understand is that that's what Bitcoin is, and most other cryptocurrencies are trying to do, is a public ledger money system. It's just digital instead of a verbal record. And so it's a digital ledger of all of the accounts that have money and where it all came from back to the beginning. And whoever invented Bitcoin realized the flaw was not anticipating that somebody else could create more. So we're just going to make a hard cap. Bitcoin is only 21 million. It's a public ledger, and there's a lot of other things about Bitcoin, but that's how it works as a monetary system.
It's decentralized and it's a public ledger, so anybody can see it. Nothing can be manipulated, and it's decentralized, which is important, because that's not what central bank digital currency would be.
Right. And one of the biggest differentiators about how it's centralized versus decentralized is control over monetary policy and visibility. So like I said, Bitcoin doesn't work very well as a currency for crime, because you can track every single transaction back to the original block of Bitcoins ever produced. And so the FBI has gotten very good at being able to track these transactions and look at internet usage, IP addresses, and see, okay, well, it's clearly you that made these transactions, that got this Bitcoin from this ransom, whatever, and we can trace it based on all the history. So it's a pretty poor currency to use for crime, actually. Now, a central bank digital currency, it is a ledger-based monetary system. It's not a credit-based monetary system. It's not a commodity-based. It's a ledger-based monetary system. But it is not a public ledger. So a central bank digital currency, so that we can understand how it differs, is essentially eliminating the banking system. So right now, you have an account at Chase. I have an account at Bank of America. Somebody who hates themselves has an account at Wells Fargo. We got all these banks out there, right? And if you eliminate that, everybody has to have an account somewhere. That's the central bank digital currency, is an account at the central bank. So this isn't unprecedented. Right now, banks have their accounts at the Federal Reserve. The federal government, their account is called the Treasury General Account. That is an account at the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve retains the power to credit and debit any accounts that are held at the Fed, right? They can put reserves in, they can take reserves out, their accounts at the Fed. So every single person then would have an account at the Federal Reserve. Now, this, number one, right now, your bank has access to the information from every transaction you've ever placed, right? They can look at the amounts, they can look at where you spent it. It can make it very difficult right now if you want to buy something from, a lot of the banks, OnlyFans recently announced that they were going to be moving away from explicit content because the banks just didn't like it. They're making it hard to do business. Lots of businesses are running into problems from their banks if they're engaging in weed businesses or firearms or gold dealers as well. Like some of these businesses, they have a lot of hard times trying to find banks that are willing to do business with them. Well, it's better to have 100 tyrants competing for power than one tyrant who has it all. Right.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So all this does is consolidate all that information, all that power to one entity, the Federal Reserve. And in theory, you think, okay, well, this would make it much easier to, like in the case of last year, if they need to hand out stimulus checks, all they have to do is credit the accounts that are worth under a certain threshold, right? It makes it easy. But then you start thinking, okay, well, what about the opposite? They retain the right to debit these accounts. And so what if there's a 100% wealth tax on any wealth above, let's say, $10 million? Mm-hmm. Well, that means they can instantly debit any dollar out of any account that's worth more than $10 million. And it's not like you could spread it out because they know all the information. They know your social security, date of birth, address, all that, just like your bank does. And so if you've got 10 accounts all worth $1 million, they know you got $10 million altogether. Further than that, you can control monetary policy and fiscal policy very efficiently. It moves from a blunt force instrument to a scalpel. So you can, in real time, say, gas prices are getting too high and we think that people are hoarding gas, driving up gas prices. Well, slap a 200% tax on gas. And you can do that immediately without waiting for inefficient IRS processes and waiting for tax filings and all that, because anytime a transaction is made, it automatically charges more for that transaction. If you want to benefit certain groups, if let's say there's a push for certain socio or economic groups who own businesses, and you want to incentivize, hey, go buy products from these types of people's businesses, they can automatically include discounts. So if you go buy stuff from this area, like let's say solar companies, we'll pay for, it'll only cost you half of the stated cost, and because we'll refund your account half of whatever the transaction cost was. And so the amount of power in a private ledger monetary system is significant to the point where it's almost destined for failure from the start.
That is some scary stuff, because I wonder if there's people listening saying, well, I do all the things everybody tells me to do. I think everything is just fine. I personally live on the other side of that coin, where I do nothing. Right? I do nothing. Like, I literally am so strong-willed. It's an issue, but I investigate. I question everything. And what you're saying is these policies that take place, these economic policies that if you're not paying too much attention, I'm sure you pay attention to much more than most, but for myself, it's like you hear something on the news, it probably won't hit your pocket 6 months, a year, 2, 3 years from now, right? As it is today. But you're saying these policies could be enacted in seconds, and next thing you know, at the pump, your bank account could be maybe not allowed to make certain transactions that you want to make, and they know everything that you're doing. We're hearing about these social credit scores that are happening in China, right? So is this kind of happening elsewhere? Are they testing the waters out? Like, what's your information you have on that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is why it's so important to be a student of history and to be watching what's going on around the world, because like I've been saying this whole time, none of this is unprecedented. At most, these are just taking it a step further than what's already been done recently or in the past. And in China right now, the central bank digital currency that they're testing out, you cannot use it to buy gold and you cannot use it to buy Bitcoin. Now, those rules went into effect before they banned Bitcoin. And so you're going to probably say, well, no matter what kind of money you have in China, you can't buy Bitcoin. And that's true. But it wasn't true when they first started testing the CBDC. When they first started testing, you could buy it with conventional money, just not the new CBDC. And it, like you're saying, it would be an immediate response to what is going on. And that is how they would likely sell it and why people would buy into it, because what we're likely to face over the coming months and years is a continual dumping of the currency as people realize more and more, I don't want to hold on to something that's losing its value as quickly as it is. So even if I don't need peanut butter, I'm going to buy extra peanut butter, because at least then I have something. I can use it next month or the month after, and it's going to cost me more if I wait to buy it. So you get to a point where people start getting rid of the money in exchange for anything, regardless of whether they need it, which accelerates this process. And what you're going to start seeing is rhetoric from the top that the reason why these bad things are happening is not because of the reckless monetary policy or reckless fiscal policy. It's because of the lack of control they have. The fact that they have to use blunt force instruments instead of scalpels. Mm-hmm. They're going to say, hey, if we had more information, if we had more dynamic and fine-tuned control over these things, then we wouldn't have overheating in certain stocks, certain meme stocks, because we would have the ability to stop purchases from being able to take place for those types of things if we deem that they're a bubble or they're getting too hot, or the opposite as well. And so as the current system accelerates downward, it seems like they'll push more and more, hey, we need a new system that allows us more control, because the reason it's failing is because we just don't have enough control.
Wow. I mean, what a ride we just took. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, from the origin of money to where we're at today. So what would you say, what's your best advice for people right now hearing this information? And probably, I mean, most, like myself, I always put my head in the sand. Like, I'm an ostrich. It's like, it's going to go away, right? Yeah. It's not going to go away. So if it's not going to go away, and it's inevitable in time, what could we be doing now to hedge hedge against what might be coming down the road?
Yeah, well, again, student of history. So I would say that's the number one thing, is to start reading books about as many as you can find about all the times in history where you have collapses of currencies and money. So two that stand out are the downfall of money and when money dies. And those are by Adam Ferguson and Frederick Taylor. Those are about the Weimar Republic in Germany. And it's eye-opening to see, okay, well, these it sounds like, if you change the names around, it sounds like they're talking about what's going on right now, because you can see, okay, well, they're planting the seeds for blaming certain people groups for, like they blamed the farmers, and that planted the seeds for blaming a certain people group as Germany. So we know what happened, a couple of decades later, planting the seeds for that broad hatred for certain people groups that were taking advantage of everybody. So we need to turn them into victims, because they were victimizers. So things like that start to happen. And the people who did get rich during these times were the people who owned real assets, who owned farmland, who owned commodities, didn't get rid of their gold and silver when it looked like it was in a bubble, didn't sell their real estate when it looked like it was in a bubble, because the people that did thought that it was getting too expensive and it was bubble. And really what was happening was the value of the currency was falling. And you can look at the stock market chart in Venezuela over the last 5 years. And it's, it's a vertical line, and you can zoom in on that and be like, the whole way it's a vertical line. You can think at any point in here, there were people who were selling thinking, hey, the stock market is in a bubble. Well, they didn't realize their currency was collapsing, and maybe their stock market didn't keep up with inflation, but it did a heck of a lot better than just the currency itself. Right. And so people who own assets, who are the borrowers, if the people in power are also borrowers, which in our case they are, because then they'll choose to make the borrowers the winners during inflation. People who own real assets, and then having exposure to countries that have fantastic demographics that are poised to do really well in the case of a global financial system disruption, where the dollar is no longer dominant and no longer siphoning so much value out of the real world. So there are a lot of emerging markets countries that are in that boat. So gold, silver, Bitcoin, even stocks and real estate, and emerging markets. These are all things that are uncorrelated bets that you can do to kind of position yourself and get yourself kind of prepared for currencies going downhill.
Wow. Well, like I said, we started the conversation off saying I knew we were going to go to school today, but we really did. So you did this video that you did, The Origin of Modern Money. I'm going to put the link below. I want people to if you watch this, go watch that. Between the two, you'll get a really good understanding of what Joe's talking about. Also, I would love for them to be able to stay connected with you. So below here, we'll put some links, but where's the best way to stay in touch with you?
The best way is on my YouTube channel, Heresy Financial, and on Twitter, it's at Heresy Financial. And for anybody who doesn't know, the word heresy means an opinion that is profoundly at odds with what is generally accepted. And so as you start to learn about the way things really are, typically throughout history, the heretics are the ones like Galileo, who said, the earth revolves or orbits the sun rather than the other way around. And so time typically proves the heretics right, and start to dig in and see what's going on behind the curtain.
Awesome, man. Well, Joe, thanks so much for spending the time and talking to our community. We do plan on doing live events at some point, so we'll invite you back. We'll do another presentation and then open up for some conversation at some point. But I just want to thank you for taking the time today and just adding value and educating our community today.
Sure thing. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, man. Thanks for showing up, and have a great day.
You too.